Hello there. Come on in, get comfortable. Find your favorite chair, maybe pour yourself a cup of tea. The night is drawing in, and it's quiet now. This is a good time for stories, a good time for thinking about some of the bigger questions in a softer light. My name is the Biblical Storyteller, and tonight, I'd like to wander with you through a question that I suspect has troubled many of us at one time or another. It's a heavy one, for sure. It's a question that feels sharp and uncomfortable, like a stone in your shoe that you just can't shake out. The question is this: is God in favor of wars? It's a fair question. You open the first part of the Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, and you don't have to read very far before you run into it. There's smoke and fire, the clash of swords, and shouts of victory. You find stories of battles commanded, of cities overthrown, of entire peoples driven out of their land, and it all seems to be happening under the banner of God. We read about a God of hosts, which is a military term, translating to the God of armies. It's an image that stands in such stark, jarring contrast to the God many of us were taught about later, a God of love, a shepherd, a father. How can both be true? How do we reconcile the Prince of Peace with the Lord of Armies? Tonight, and in our next few talks together, we're not going to try and solve this like a math problem. There isn't a neat and tidy formula that makes all the sharp edges smooth. Instead, we're going to approach it like a story. Because that's what the Bible is first and foremost: a grand, sprawling, complicated, beautiful, and sometimes deeply troubling story of God's relationship with humanity. Our goal isn't to win a debate or to create a bulletproof theological defense. It's simply to understand, to sit with the story, to feel its weight, to see the world through the eyes of the people who lived it, and maybe, just maybe, to catch a glimpse of the bigger picture they were seeing, even if it's a picture that's hard for us to look at. So, let's begin where the difficulty begins. Let's travel back in time, not just a few centuries, but millennia. We need to step into a world that is profoundly different from our own. The air smells different. The stars look brighter without our city lights. And the very way people think about life, death, and the divine is almost alien to us. This is the world of the ancient Near East, the cradle of civilization, the lands we now know as the Middle East. It's a world of sun-baked empires, of powerful kings who called themselves gods, and of small, tribal peoples just trying to survive in the shadow of those empires. Imagine, for a moment, that you are a farmer living around 1400 BC in the land of Canaan. Your world is small. It consists of the fields you plow, the village where your family lives, and the walled city of your local king, just a few miles away. Your life is governed by the seasons, the planting time, the harvest time, and the dry time. But it's also governed by something else: fear. You fear the drought that could kill your crops. You fear the locusts that could devour them. And you fear the army of the neighboring city-state, or the Hittite Empire from the north, or the Egyptian Empire from the south, that could sweep through, burn your fields, take your grain, and carry your children off into slavery. This isn't a hypothetical fear. It's the lived reality of nearly everyone. Life is precarious. Power is everything. In this world, religion isn't a private matter. It's not something you do for an hour on the weekend. It is woven into the very fabric of existence. Every city, every tribe, every nation has its god, or more often, its pantheon of gods. And these gods are not distant, abstract beings. They are active, partisan, and powerful. Marduk is the god of Babylon. When Babylon wins a war, it is because Marduk has defeated the god of the other nation. Chemosh is the god of the Moabites. The king of Moab offers sacrifices to Chemosh to secure his favor in battle. The gods are, in essence, divine warlords, celestial patrons of their respective peoples. War, in this context, is not just a political or economic event. It is a theological one. It is a contest between the gods. When your army marches out, you are marching with your God. Your victory is your God's victory. Your defeat is your God's humiliation. An inscription from a Moabite king, Mesha, found on a stone tablet, brags about his victories over Israel. He says, "And Chemosh said to me, 'Go, take Nebo from Israel.' So I went by night and fought against it from the break of dawn until noon. And I took from there the vessels of Yahweh, and I dragged them before Chemosh." You see, for King Mesha, his victory was proof that his god, Chemosh, was stronger than Israel's God, Yahweh. He even captures the sacred items from Yahweh's temple and presents them as tribute to his own God, like a trophy. This was the common understanding across the entire region. The gods fought for their people, and the people fought for their gods. This world is dominated by a concept we might call might makes right. The strongest nation has the strongest God. The most powerful king is the one most favored by the divine. Justice is a luxury. Mercy is a sign of weakness. The annals of the Assyrian kings, for example, are filled with horrifying boasts of their cruelty. They flayed their enemies alive, built pyramids of skulls, and deported entire populations to break their spirit. This was not seen as monstrous. It was seen as a sign of their power and the power of their god, Asher. It was a warning to anyone who might dare to defy them. Into this brutal, violent, and chaotic world, a new story begins. It starts not in a mighty empire, but with a nomadic family from Ur of the Chaldees, a city in modern-day Iraq. It begins with a man named Abram, later called Abraham. And the God who speaks to him is different. This God, Yahweh, doesn't introduce himself as the God of a city or an army. He introduces himself with a staggering claim, "I am God Almighty." And he doesn't just promise to make Abram's descendants a great nation. He promises something more. "In you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Pause on that for a moment. Right from the very beginning of Israel's story, the stated goal is universal blessing. It's not about dominating the other families of the earth, but about being a vehicle for their blessing. This is a radically different starting point from that of Babylon or Assyria, but the path from that promise to its fulfillment is long and winding, and it passes through the very real and very violent world we've just described. Abraham's descendants, the Israelites, eventually find themselves as slaves in the mightiest empire of the day, Egypt. For 400 years, they labor under the whip of the pharaohs. They build store cities. They make bricks without straw. Their male children are ordered to be drowned in the Nile. They are a people with no power, no land, and seemingly no future. They are at the absolute bottom of the might makes right ladder, and in their misery, they cry out. The God who hears their cry is the same God who spoke to Abraham, and he comes not with gentle persuasion, but with power. This is the first major instance where we see God engage in what can only be described as divine warfare. But notice who he is fighting. He is not, at this point, leading an Israelite army against an Egyptian one. The Israelites are slaves. They have no army. God is fighting on their behalf, and his opponent is not just Pharaoh, but the entire Egyptian pantheon, the very gods that were thought to undergird the empire's power. This is the story of the plagues. We often read them as just a series of nasty magical tricks to get Pharaoh to change his mind. But for an ancient person living in that world, each plague was a direct, devastating attack on a specific Egyptian deity. The first plague turns the Nile River to blood. This wasn't just an ecological disaster, it was a theological statement. The Nile was the lifeblood of Egypt, personified and worshipped as the god Happy. When the Nile turns to blood, it is Yahweh declaring that he, not Happy, controls the life of Egypt. Frogs, associated with the goddess of fertility, Heket, swarm the land, becoming a curse instead of a blessing. The plague of darkness is a direct assault on the most powerful god in the Egyptian pantheon, the sun god Ra, Pharaoh's supposed father. For 3 days, the god of the Hebrew slaves blots out the sun god of the Egyptian empire. It's a cosmic smackdown. This culminates in the Passover. The angel of death passes through the land, striking down the firstborn of Egypt, from the house of Pharaoh to the dungeon, but passing over the homes of the Israelites, marked with the blood of a lamb. This is terrifying, no doubt. But in the context of the ancient Near East, it is the ultimate demonstration of power. The god of the slaves has defeated the god of the empire. Yahweh has proven himself stronger than Ra, Happy, and Pharaoh himself. The contest is over. Egypt is broken, and the slaves walk free. This is the foundational story for Israel. Their God is a God who liberates the oppressed. Their identity as a people is forged not in a victory they won themselves, but in a miraculous rescue performed for them. They leave Egypt not as a conquering army, but as a column of refugees, heading into the wilderness with an uncertain future, guided by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. They arrive at the foot of a mountain called Sinai, and it is here that the story takes another unique turn. In the ancient world, kings gave laws. Hammurabi of Babylon gave his famous code of laws. But here, at Sinai, God himself gives the law directly to the people. And this law, the Torah, is unlike any other legal code of its time. Yes, It has rules about property and damages, like other codes, but it is filled with something revolutionary, a profound concern for the vulnerable. You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. Remember where you came from, the law says. Remember what it was like to be a helpless immigrant, a slave. So when you have your own land, treat the foreigner living among you with justice and compassion. You shall not mistreat any widow or orphan. The law repeatedly singles out the three most vulnerable groups in ancient society: the widow, the orphan, and the immigrant, and places them under special protection. There are laws for leaving the edges of your fields unharvested so the poor can glean food. There are laws for interest-free loans to the needy. There are laws for a Sabbath day of rest, not just for the landowners, but for their male and female servants, their animals, and the foreigner within their gates. This is the character of the God who is revealing himself to Israel. He is a God of justice, of compassion, of liberation for the oppressed. And this is precisely what makes what comes next so difficult for us to understand. Because after receiving this beautiful, compassionate law, the Israelites are told to go and conquer the land of Canaan. And the instructions are brutal. The book of Deuteronomy contains the marching orders. Regarding the nations in the promised land, the command is stark. You must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. The Hebrew word for this is hirm. It means to devote something or someone to God, usually through destruction. It's the same word used for things that are so holy they cannot be touched, and for things that are so corrupt they must be utterly removed. And here, it is applied to the people living in the land of Canaan: the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. This is the heart of the problem for us. How can the God who says, "Love the sojourner," also say, "Show no mercy"? How can the God who commands care for the widow and orphan command the destruction of cities, which would inevitably create widows and orphans? This is where many people close the book, and frankly, it's hard to blame them. To even begin to approach this, we have to hold two things in tension. First, we have to acknowledge the raw horror of the command. We cannot and should not try to explain it away as if it's nothing. It is deeply disturbing. Second, we must try to understand the rationale that the text itself provides. Why was such a drastic measure commanded? The text immediately gives the reason: lest they teach you to do according to all their abominable practices that they have done for their gods, and so you sin against the Lord your God. The biblical narrative portrays Canaanite culture not as a neutral or innocent civilization, but as one that was systemically and profoundly corrupt. The abominable practices mentioned are not just about believing in different gods. The texts, supported by some archaeological findings and texts from neighboring cultures, describe a society steeped in religious violence, sexual exploitation, and even child sacrifice. The prophets would later rail against the Israelites for adopting these very practices, worshipping the god Molech, for example, by passing their children through the fire. From the perspective of the biblical author, Canaan was like a body riddled with a terminal, contagious cancer. The command for Hirm was not presented as a matter of ethnic cleansing or racial superiority. It was presented as a form of divine judgment, a radical surgery to prevent this spiritual sickness from infecting Israel, and, through Israel, the rest of the world. Remember the promise to Abraham, that through him all families of the earth would be blessed. According to the narrative's logic, if Israel became just another Canaanite tribe with slightly different god names, that promise would die. The plan for universal blessing would fail at the first hurdle. The conquest, therefore, is framed as a necessary, albeit terrible, act of purification to create a space where a different kind of society, the kind envisioned in the law of Sinai, could take root. This doesn't make it easy to swallow. The idea of war as divine judgment is a dangerous one, and it has been misused throughout history to justify horrific atrocities. But within the story itself, it's not a license for Israel to do whatever it wants. It's a specific, one-time command for a specific purpose. It's not a standing order for how to treat all enemies for all time. Now, let's look at how this conquest actually unfolds in the stories. The first major city they face is Jericho. It's a fortress, seemingly impenetrable. An Israelite general would probably plan a long siege, try to starve the city out, build ramps, and use battering rams. That's how wars were fought. But what are God's instructions to Joshua, the leader of Israel? They are, from a military standpoint, utterly absurd. March around the city once a day for 6 days, with 7 priests carrying 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, and let the priests blow the trumpets. And when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat. Can you imagine Joshua explaining this battle plan to his commanders? Right, men, here's the plan. We're going to walk around it for a week, and then we're going to yell. It's almost comical. It is designed to be so. The entire strategy is structured to make one thing crystal clear. This is not your victory. You will not win this by your military might or your strategic genius. You will win this because I, God, am giving it to you. The Battle of Jericho is not a testament to Israel's strength, but to God's. The people's role is simply to trust and obey a command that makes no logical sense. And when the walls fall, there can be no doubt in anyone's mind who brought them down. And even in this story of destruction, there is a surprising thread of mercy. Before the attack, Joshua sends spies into the city. They are hidden by a Canaanite prostitute named Rahab. Why does she help them? Because, she says, I know that the Lord has given you the land. For the Lord your God, He is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. She, a resident of the city marked for destruction, professes faith in Israel's God. She recognizes that Yahweh is not just another tribal deity, but the God of all creation. And because of her faith, she and her entire family are saved. When the city is destroyed, her house, marked by a scarlet cord, is spared. This is a crucial detail. It tells us that the judgment on Canaan was not, at its core, about ethnicity. It was about allegiance. Rahab the Canaanite, because she turned to Yahweh, was welcomed into the community of Israel. In fact, she ends up in the genealogy of King David, and even more astonishingly, in the genealogy of Jesus himself. This small story is a crack of light in a very dark narrative. It shows that the door was never completely shut. The possibility of being included, rather than excluded, existed even for those on the wrong side of the conflict, if they were willing to acknowledge the one true God. After the initial phase of the conquest under Joshua, the story moves into a long, dark, and chaotic period known as the time of the Judges. The book of Judges is one of the bloodiest and most disturbing books in the Bible. It describes a repeating cycle that goes something like this. The people of Israel forget God and start worshiping the Canaanite gods, the Baals and the Asherahs. As a result, God allows them to be oppressed by a neighboring people, the Moabites, the Midianites, the Philistines. The Israelites suffer under this oppression for years, until they finally cry out to God for help. In response, God raises up a judge, who is not a courtroom official, but a military deliverer, a charismatic warlord. This judge leads Israel to victory, and the land has peace for a generation. Then the judge dies, and the whole cycle starts over again. It is a grim and repetitive story of failure, and the battles within it continue to emphasize God's power over human strength. Take the story of Gideon, one of the most famous judges. He is from the weakest clan of his tribe, and he is the least in his family. When the angel of the Lord finds him, he's threshing wheat at the bottom of a winepress, hiding from the Midianite raiders. This is not a heroic figure. This is a man terrified. God tells him to lead Israel against the massive Midianite army. Gideon, full of doubt, asks for a sign. He puts a wool fleece on the ground and says, "If there is dew on the fleece alone, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand." In the morning, it's just as he asked, but he's still not convinced. He asks for a reverse sign. Let it be dry on the fleece alone, and on all the ground let there be dew. The next morning, that's what happens. It's a touchingly human portrait of fear and the need for reassurance. Finally, Gideon gathers an army. 32,000 Israelite men come out to fight. But God tells him, "The people with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, 'My own hand has saved me.'" God doesn't want anyone to think this is a human victory. So, he instructs Gideon to send home anyone who is afraid. 22,000 men leave. Only 10,000 remain. Still too many, God says. He then gives another strange instruction. "Take them down to the water, and I will test them for you there." He tells Gideon to watch how the men drink. Those who cup their hands to drink are to be kept. Those who get down on their knees and put their face in the water are to be sent home. Only 300 men drink from their hands. Gideon's army is reduced from 32,000 to 300. 300 men against an army described as like locusts in number, their camels without number, as the sand that is on the seashore in abundance. The odds are impossible, and the battle plan is, once again, bizarre. Gideon divides his 300 men into 3 companies. He gives each man a trumpet, an empty jar, and a torch to put inside the jar. They surround the Midianite camp in the middle of the night. On Gideon's signal, they are all to blow their trumpets, smash their jars, hold up their torches, and shout, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." The sudden blast of 300 trumpets, the crash of 300 jars, the flare of 300 torches, and the terrifying war cry from all directions in the dead of night throws the sleeping Midianite camp into a panic. In the confusion and darkness, the Midianite soldiers turn on each other, and the entire army dissolves into chaos and flees. The victory is total, and it is won without the Israelite army striking a single blow. It is a victory of psychology, of noise and light, orchestrated by God to show that He is the one who saves. These stories, Jericho and Gideon, are paradigms. They illustrate a central theme of the Old Testament's holy war narratives. While God does command warfare, He consistently does so in ways that sideline human military prowess and highlight His own supernatural power. The goal is not to create a nation of elite soldiers, but a nation that depends utterly on God for its survival. However, the book of Judges does not end on a triumphant note. The cycles of violence become more and more depraved. The judges themselves become less heroic. The book culminates in a horrifying story of civil war and atrocity, ending with one of the saddest and most telling lines in the entire Bible. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. This is a devastating conclusion. The system of charismatic warlords, of holy war as a response to crisis, has failed. It has not led to a just and stable society. It has led to anarchy, brutality, and moral collapse. The very model of God raising up warriors to save the people has proven to be an unstable and ultimately self-destructive path for the nation. It turns out that a nation built on reactive warfare, even when commanded by God, cannot sustain itself. The people are left yearning for something more, for a different kind of leadership, for a king who can bring order to the chaos. And so, as we close this first chapter of our journey, we are left with a very complex and troubling picture. We have a God who reveals Himself as a God of justice and compassion for the weak. A God whose ultimate plan is to bless all of humanity. Yet, this same God enters into the brutal world of the ancient Near East and uses the very tools of that world war and conquest to accomplish His purposes. He appears as a God of armies, fighting for His chosen people. But even within these difficult stories, we see a consistent pattern. The wars are not meant to glorify human strength, but to demonstrate God's. The victories are often strange, supernatural, and symbolic. There are threads of mercy and inclusion, like the story of Rahab, that hint at a wider purpose beyond mere national conquest. And finally, the narrative itself shows the ultimate failure of this model of holy war to create a lasting peace or a righteous people. The period of the judges ends in exhaustion and despair, showing that this way of relating to God and the world is not the final answer. We have looked at the what. We have seen the wars, the commands, the difficult and violent picture of God as a warrior. We've tried to understand it in its own historical and theological context, a world of warring gods and divine combat. But we haven't yet fully explored the why. What was the deeper theological purpose behind it all? How does this violent beginning connect to the ultimate promise of universal peace? The story is far from over. It is, in fact, just getting started. The picture is still incomplete, waiting for the rest of the story to fill in the missing pieces, to bring clarity to the shadows, and to steer this violent history toward a very different destination. For now, let's just sit with the tension. Let's acknowledge the difficulty. It's okay for this to be unsettling. It's a story that asks a lot of us. It asks us to enter a world very different from our own and to wrestle with a picture of God that is not always comfortable. And in that wrestling, perhaps, is where the real understanding begins. So, we find ourselves sitting here in the quiet, holding this difficult, uncomfortable picture we painted in our last conversation. A picture of God as a warrior, a lord of armies, leading a refugee nation in a brutal conquest. We ended in the chaos and despair of the book of Judges, with a sense that this model of holy war, this cycle of violence and deliverance, was not a sustainable path to peace or righteousness. It left the people broken and the story feeling unresolved. We've seen the what, and it's a heavy thing to behold. Now, as we settle back in tonight, let's take the next step on our journey together. Let's gently start to ask why. The biblical story is not a simple chronicle of events, like a list of kings and battles. It's a story with a point of view. It insists that these events, as harsh as they are, have meaning. They are not random acts of divine violence. There is a logic to them, a theological foundation that the narrative itself wants us to understand. Our task tonight is not to justify or excuse, but to listen. To listen to the reasons the story gives for its own difficult parts. To understand the world as it was understood then, and to see if we can trace the threads of a divine purpose running through even the blood-soaked pages of the Conquest. It seems to me that the why given in the text clusters around three great, interconnected ideas. Think of them as three pillars holding up this difficult part of the story. The first is the idea of divine judgment, that the wars were not primarily about Israel's gain, but about a reckoning for the cultures already in the land. The second is the idea of divine protection, that this harsh action was necessary to preserve a fragile and world-changing promise that God had made. And the third is the idea of divine revelation, that these events, in their own shocking way, were meant to reveal something true and essential about God's character to a world that wouldn't have understood it any other way. Judgment, protection, and revelation. Let's take our time and walk around each of these pillars, one by one. Let's begin with the heaviest one, war as divine judgment. As we saw, the command to enact Hirm, or complete destruction, upon the Canaanite cities is perhaps the single most difficult command in the entire Bible. The reason given, you'll recall, was to prevent the Israelites from learning their abominable practices. But the story gives us a much deeper and more patient context than that. This judgment didn't come out of nowhere. It wasn't a sudden, capricious decision. To understand this, we have to go all the way back to the beginning, to the promise God made to Abraham in the book of Genesis. It's a foundational moment, long before the slavery in Egypt, long before the conquest of Canaan. God promises Abraham that his descendants will inherit this land, but then he adds a very strange and specific detail. He tells Abraham that before this happens, his descendants will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. Only after that long period of suffering will they come back and take possession of the land. Why the delay? Why 4 centuries of waiting and slavery? God gives the reason in the very next line. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Let that sink in for a moment. This single phrase is one of the most important keys to unlocking this whole difficult question. God is, in essence, putting the conquest of Canaan on hold for 400 years. He is waiting. The word Amorites is used here as a general term for the various peoples living in Canaan. And God says their iniquity, their sin, their corruption, their societal sickness has not yet reached its final, terminal stage. There is still, it seems, a chance for things to turn around. He is demonstrating a staggering degree of patience. This is not a hair-trigger God, eager to smite. This is a God who waits, who gives centuries for a culture to choose its path. The conquest, when it finally comes, is portrayed as the tragic end of a long, slow, and patient process. It is the final act for a society that had, over many generations, chosen a path of self-destruction and deep moral decay. So, what was this iniquity that took 400 years to become complete? The Bible paints a grim picture. It wasn't just about worshiping idols made of wood and stone. It was about the kind of society that this worship created. The prophets who came later, when they condemned the Israelites for following Canaanite ways, give us a clearer picture. They speak of rampant social injustice, of the wealthy and powerful crushing the poor and the weak. They speak of sexual rights woven into the fabric of their religion, turning the sacred act of union into a tool of cultic exploitation. And they speak of the darkest practice of all child sacrifice. This is a point we must be very careful with, but it is central to the biblical rationale. The texts speak of the worship of gods like Molech, where parents would make their children pass through the fire. For a long time, some scholars thought this was just symbolic, or perhaps exaggerated propaganda. But archaeological evidence from the wider region, particularly from the Phoenicians and their colony of Carthage cultures, which were direct descendants of the Canaanites, has uncovered cemeteries called tophets. These sites contain thousands of urns filled with the cremated remains of infants and small children, often buried with inscriptions dedicating them to the gods. This was real. There were cultures in the ancient world where the path to divine favor, to a good harvest, or victory in battle was paved with the bodies of their own children. Now, try to see the world from the perspective of the God of the Old Testament. The God whose law, given at Sinai, commands special protection for the widow, the orphan, the immigrant. The God who demands that justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. This God looks at a culture, or a network of cultures, where the most vulnerable are not protected, but sacrificed, where the social fabric is built on oppression, and the religious fabric is built on ritualized cruelty. From this perspective, the land of Canaan is not a neutral place. It has become a house of horrors. It is a society built on a foundation of death. The conquest, then, is framed not as an act of imperial ambition for Israel, but as an act of radical, divine surgery. It's the demolition of a house that is so filled with toxic mold that it is no longer habitable and threatens to contaminate everything around it. It's a grim and terrible task, but the narrative presents it as a necessary one, a judgment against a system that had become fundamentally anti-life. We can see a powerful parallel to this in the much earlier story of Noah and the flood. The book of Genesis says that before the flood, the earth was filled with violence. The Hebrew word there is hamas, which means more than just physical violence. It means corruption, extortion, cruelty, a complete breakdown of moral order. And what is God's reaction? It is not anger, but grief. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. This is a stunning phrase. The decision to bring judgment, to decreate and start again, comes from a place of sorrow, not rage. Perhaps we can see the conquest of Canaan in a similar light. A localized flood, not of water, but of fire and sword, against a specific pocket of humanity where the hamas, the violence and corruption, had reached a point of no return. It is a terrible remedy for a terrible disease. Even the prophet Isaiah, centuries later, speaks of God's acts of judgment as his strange work, his alien task. The implication is that this is not what God wants to do. It is not his preferred way of interacting with the world. Creation, blessing, and life are his normal work. Destruction is his strange, alien work, something he undertakes only when all else has failed. This framework of judgment helps us understand the why, but it immediately raises another question. Was this just about punishing the Canaanites, or was there another purpose at play? This brings us to our second pillar, the idea of divine protection. The conquest wasn't just about tearing something down, it was about building something new. was about creating a space, a container, where the promise made to Abraham could be protected and nurtured. Remember that promise, that through Abraham's family, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. This is the grand, overarching goal of the entire Old Testament story. It's a plan for universal redemption. But for that plan to work, the seed of Abraham, his physical and spiritual descendants, had to survive. Imagine you are trying to grow a rare and precious orchid in the middle of a dense, thorny jungle filled with choking weeds and predatory animals. You can't just toss the seed on the ground and hope for the best. You would first have to clear a patch of land. You'd have to pull out the thorns and the weeds. You'd have to build a fence to keep the animals out. It would be a violent, difficult process of clearing and separation. But your goal would not be the destruction of the jungle for its own sake. Your goal would be the protection of the orchid, so that one day it could flower and its beauty could be seen by all. This is a helpful metaphor for the conquest. Israel was the orchid. The promise they carried was the seed of future blessing for the world. Canaan, in the state it was in, was the thorny, hostile jungle. God's command to clear the land was a command to create a protected space, a kind of cultural and theological greenhouse, where the unique revelation he had given them, the law of Sinai, the worship of the one true God, the principles of justice and mercy, could take root and grow without being immediately choked out by the surrounding paganism. The great danger was a phenomenon called syncretism, the blending of religions. It was the constant temptation for Israel throughout its history. It's much easier to get along with your neighbors if you just add their gods to your own pantheon. You worship Baal. Great, we worship Yahweh. Let's just say they're both powerful. We can have a shrine for Yahweh and a shrine for Baal. Problem solved. This kind of religious compromise was the norm in the ancient world, but for Israel, it was a lethal threat. The revelation they carried was that Yahweh is God alone. He is not one God among many. He is the creator of all things, and his character, as revealed in the Torah, is holy and just. To mix the worship of Yahweh with the worship of Baal, a god associated with storm and fertility, but also with the very practices of injustice and ritualized cruelty that Yahweh condemned, was not just a compromise. It was a contradiction. It would be like mixing clean water with poison. The resulting mixture is no longer life-giving. The harsh separation commanded at the beginning was a radical attempt to prevent this from happening, to keep the water pure. And the subsequent history of Israel shows just how real this threat was. Centuries later, under the rule of King Ahab and his Phoenician wife Jezebel, the worship of Baal was officially promoted in Israel. The prophets of Yahweh were hunted and killed. The nation was brought to the brink of complete apostasy. It took the dramatic intervention of the prophet Elijah on Mount Carmel to turn the tide. The fear expressed in Deuteronomy that the Canaanites would teach you to do according to all their abominable practices was not a paranoid fantasy. It was a prophecy that came dangerously close to being fulfilled time and time again. But here is the most crucial point in this whole discussion of judgment and protection. The standard of justice was not just for the Canaanites. It was for everyone, including Israel. This was not a story of a favored ethnic group being given a license to destroy others. God was not a tribal deity who graded on a curve for his chosen people. The law was absolute. In the book of Deuteronomy, right alongside the commands for conquest, God gives Israel a stark and terrifying warning. Moses tells the people, essentially, "Do not think for a moment that God is giving you this land because you are so righteous or morally superior. You are a stiff-necked and rebellious people. God is giving you this land because of the wickedness of these nations and to keep the promise he made to Abraham." And then he delivers the knockout punch. He warns them that if they settle in the land and adopt the very same practices as the Canaanites, if they start to worship idols, to oppress the poor, to sacrifice their children, then the land will vomit them out, just as it was about to vomit out its current inhabitants. The judgment was not tied to ethnicity, it was tied to behavior. The land itself, in this theological vision, has an immune system. It cannot tolerate systemic injustice and idolatry, no matter who is practicing it. And this is exactly what happens later in Israel's history. When the northern kingdom of Israel becomes deeply corrupt, God uses the Assyrian Empire as his instrument of judgment. He allows the Assyrians to conquer the land and deport the people. A century later, when the southern kingdom of Judah follows the same path, God uses the Babylonian Empire to do the same thing. They destroy Jerusalem, burn the temple, and carry the people into exile. The prophet Jeremiah, watching the Babylonian army surround Jerusalem, sees it not as a national tragedy, but as the righteous judgment of God, the same judgment that fell on the Canaanites 1,000 years earlier. God used Israel to judge Canaan. Now he was using Babylon to judge Israel. This is a staggering theological claim. It proves that Yahweh was never just Israel's God. He is the God of all nations, and his standard of justice is universal. He plays no favorites. This fact, more than any other, lifts the story of the conquest out of the realm of simple nationalistic conquest and places it into the much larger, more coherent, and more terrifying framework of universal divine justice. This brings us to our third pillar, divine revelation. In a strange and paradoxical way, these wars were meant to reveal something true about God's character to a world that was spiritually tone-deaf. The people of the ancient Near East understood one language above all others, the language of power. As we discussed, a nation's strength was a direct reflection of its God's strength. For God to communicate with this world, he had to speak a language it could understand. The Exodus and the Conquest were, in this sense, a massive, world-shaking theological statement. The central claim was not Israel is strong, but Yahweh is God. The entire campaign was a cosmic contest, a clash of the gods played out on the stage of history. Yahweh, the god of a band of homeless slaves, systematically defeated and humiliated the pantheon of the Egyptian Empire, the world's superpower. Then, he defeated the host of gods worshipped by the city-states of Canaan. This was a radical subversion of the ancient world's political and theological order. We see this theme played out in miniature in a wonderfully revealing and slightly humorous story from the time of the Judges in the first book of Samuel. The Israelites are at war with the Philistines, a powerful people who lived on the coast. In a desperate move, the Israelites bring the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred box representing God's throne and presence, into their battle camp, thinking of it as a kind of magical good luck charm that will guarantee victory. It's a profound misunderstanding of God's nature, treating him like a tribal idol to be manipulated. The plan backfires spectacularly. The Israelites are routed, and the Philistines capture the ark. For the Philistines, this is the ultimate victory. They have not only defeated Israel's army, but they have captured their God. As was the custom, they take the ark as a spoil of war and place it in the temple of their chief god, Dagon, in the city of Ashdod. They place it at the feet of the statue of Dagon, a trophy presented to their victorious deity. The contest is over. Dagon has defeated Yahweh. But the next morning, the priests of Dagon enter the temple and find a shocking sight. The massive statue of Dagon has fallen from its pedestal and is lying face down on the ground before the Ark of the Covenant, as if it is bowing in worship. Puzzled and unnerved, they hoist their god back up onto his pedestal. The next morning, it's even worse. They enter the temple to find Dagon fallen on his face again before the ark. But this time, the statue is broken. Its head and both its hands have been severed and are lying on the threshold. Only the torso remains. The message is unmistakable. Yahweh cannot be captured. He is not a defeated deity. Even in the heart of an enemy temple, he is still God, and the false gods of the nations will be broken before him. The story doesn't end there. A plague of tumors breaks out in the city of Ashdod. The terrified city leaders send the ark to the next Philistine city, Gath. The plague breaks out in Gath. They send it to Ekron. The people of Ekron cry out, "They have brought the ark of the God of Israel to us, to kill us and our people." The power of Yahweh is a toxic, destructive force within their land. Finally, after 7 months of chaos and disease, the terrified Philistine lords devise a plan to send the ark back to Israel. Loaded with guilt offerings of golden tumors and golden mice, begging for forgiveness from this terrifying, untamable God they had dared to capture. This story is a perfect microcosm of what the larger conquest narrative is trying to reveal. Yahweh is not a local deity confined to a mountain in Sinai or a temple in Israel. He is God everywhere. His power is absolute, and he cannot be manipulated or controlled. He is holy and dangerous, and the idols of the nations are nothing before him. This was a lesson taught not through a philosophical treatise, but through a story of a toppled statue and a panicked empire. Furthermore, these war stories consistently reveal a God with upside-down values. He fights for the powerless. As we've seen, his foundational act is liberating slaves. When he chooses leaders, he doesn't pick the obvious candidates. He chooses Moses, a man with a speech impediment. He chooses Gideon, a coward hiding in a winepress. He chooses Jephthah, the son of a prostitute, an outcast driven from his home. He chooses Deborah, a woman, to be the supreme commander in a patriarchal society. Over and over again, the story shows God siding with the weak, the small, and the marginalized, and using them to confound the strong. This reveals a core aspect of his character. His strength is made perfect in weakness. He is a God who consistently subverts human expectations of power. So, when we put it all together, the why becomes clearer, if no less challenging. The Old Testament wars are portrayed within the narrative itself as a convergence of these three purposes. They are a reluctant and strange act of judgment against cultures that had become systemically corrupt and violent. They are a necessary act of protection, clearing a space to preserve the fragile promise of universal blessing that Israel carried for the world. And they are a stark and powerful act of revelation, teaching Israel and the surrounding nations about the unique character of Yahweh, his universal sovereignty, his justice, his holiness, and his surprising preference for the weak in the only language that ancient culture truly understood. Does this make the violence easy to accept? No. Does it wipe away the horror of the command to show no mercy? Of course not. A story can be coherent without being comfortable. We can understand the internal logic of the narrative without having to feel good about it. What this understanding does, however, is prevent us from drawing the wrong conclusions. It shows us that the goal was not to establish a principle of racial supremacy or to provide a timeless manual for holy war. It was a specific, historical, and theological event with a specific purpose within a much larger story. And it's becoming clear that this entire model, a nation-state with physical borders, a human king, and a God who fights their battles, was itself a temporary stage. It was a necessary, but ultimately flawed, part of the journey. The narrative itself seems to sense this, even as the stories of David and Solomon unfold, bringing Israel to the height of its power. New voices begin to emerge from within Israel. The voices of the prophets. They look at the kingdom with its armies and its politics and its compromises, and they begin to speak of a different kind of kingdom, a different kind of king, and a different kind of peace. They begin to dream of a future where God's purposes are fulfilled not through the sword, but through the heart. A future where the very implements of war are transformed into tools of life. The story is beginning to turn a corner, leaving the battlefield behind and looking toward a new horizon. And it is toward that horizon and those prophetic whispers of a coming change that we will turn our attention next time. We have journeyed together through some very difficult country, haven't we? We've stood in the smoke and dust of ancient battles, trying to understand the picture of a God of armies. We've wrestled with the reasons the story gives for this violence, the solemn pillars of judgment, protection, and revelation that held up that age of conquest. We saw a God entering into a brutal world and speaking its language of power, all to carve out a space for a promise that was meant for all of humanity. But we also saw that this model, a holy nation engaged in holy war, was ultimately unstable. It ended not in lasting peace, but in the chaos, bloodshed, and moral anarchy of the era of the judges, with a people crying out for something different. Tonight, let's listen to where the story goes from there. Because the story itself seems to understand that the path of the sword is not the final destination. The Bible is not a static book with a single, unchanging view of God. It is a developing story, a progressive revelation, and within its pages, we can hear a new song begin to emerge, faint at first, then growing stronger and clearer. It's a song that critiques the very model of power and violence we've been examining. This is the story of the shift from the clash of swords to the whispers of peace, a change that happens not after the Old Testament, but deep within it. The people's solution to the chaos of the judges was simple and, from a human perspective, perfectly logical. They wanted a king. They looked around at the other nations, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Philistines, and saw that they had kings who led their armies and gave them stability. So they came to the prophet Samuel, the last of the judges, and said, "Give us a king to judge us like all the nations." Samuel was grieved by this. The story tells us that he saw it as a rejection of God's direct rule over the people. God's response to the heartbroken prophet is revealing. He tells Samuel, "Obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them." It's a moment of profound sadness. God essentially says, if this is what they want, let them have it. Let them learn from it. He even has Samuel warn them what this will be like. A king, Samuel says, will take your sons for his chariots and armies. He will take your daughters to be his cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards. He will tax your grain and your flocks. And in that day, Samuel warns, you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. Despite the warning, the people insisted, and so began the age of the monarchy. It started with Saul, a tall and handsome but deeply flawed man. It reached its zenith under his successor, King David. David was the model warrior king. He was brilliant, charismatic, a military genius who defeated Israel's enemies, captured the city of Jerusalem, and made it his capital, and united the 12 tribes into a single, powerful kingdom. His son Solomon inherited this kingdom and brought it to its golden age of wealth, power, and international influence. Solomon built the magnificent temple in Jerusalem, a permanent, glorious house for the Ark of the Covenant, a symbol that God was now dwelling securely in the midst of his people. On the surface, it seemed to be working. The model of having a king like all the nations, had brought stability and prestige. The God of armies had a human general, a king, to lead those armies. The kingdom was secure. This, surely, was the goal. But the cracks began to show almost immediately. Solomon, in his pursuit of wealth and political alliances, married hundreds of foreign women, and to please them, built shrines to their gods Chemosh, Melech, Ashtoreth, in the very hills surrounding Jerusalem. The poison of syncretism, which the initial conquest was meant to prevent, was now being invited in through the front door by the king himself. After Solomon's death, the kingdom violently split in two. The northern 10 tribes became Israel, and the southern 2 became Judah. What followed was 400 years of slow decline, a dreary history of political intrigue, assassinations, civil wars, social injustice, and a deepening slide into the very idolatry of the peoples they had once conquered. The great experiment of the monarchy, the attempt to be a nation like all the nations, was proving to be a spiritual and political disaster. The system was failing. It is precisely in this period of crisis, of political failure and spiritual decay, that a new kind of voice emerges in Israel. These are the prophets. They are not like the court priests or the official soothsayers of other nations. They are rarely insiders. They are often outsiders, strange figures from the margins of society. They are poets, shepherds, farmers, and dissenters. They are men who claim to have heard a word directly from God. And this word is often a fiery, uncomfortable, and deeply challenging word of critique against the king, the priests, and the entire nation. They are the conscience of Israel, the divine opposition party, and their message begins to fundamentally reshape the understanding of God, his people, and his purpose for the world. The prophets begin by systematically dismantling the people's core assumptions about their relationship with God. They had come to believe that because they were the chosen people, because they had the temple, because they performed the sacrifices, they were automatically in God's good graces. Their national security was mistaken for divine approval. The prophets arrived to shatter this illusion. Consider the prophet Amos. He wasn't a polished courtier from Jerusalem. He was a shepherd, a tender of sycamore fig trees from a small village in the southern kingdom of Judah, and God sends him to the prosperous northern kingdom of Israel, to its bustling capital of Samaria, to deliver a message of pure fire. Israel was at the height of its economic power. They had beautiful houses of hewn stone, luxurious ivory-paneled furniture, and they held lavish religious festivals. They were, by all outward appearances, a blessed and successful nation. Amos arrives and launches into a series of judgments against the surrounding nations for their war crimes and cruelty. The Israelites listening would have cheered him on. Yes, condemn the wicked Syrians, condemn the brutal Philistines, but then, in a stunning rhetorical move, Amos turns the prophetic spotlight directly onto them. He condemns Israel for a different kind of crime, not for losing a battle, but for selling the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. He condemns them because they trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth and turn aside the way of the afflicted. Then he delivers the knockout blow, quoting God directly. I despise your feasts, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. This is a theological earthquake. God is saying that all their religious activity, the very things they thought were earning his favor, are meaningless, even offensive to him, because their society is built on injustice. True worship is not about the smell of incense. It's about the practice of justice. The prophets were radically recentering religion from the temple altar to the public square, from ritual piety to social ethics. Being God's people was not a status to be claimed, but a standard of justice to be lived. Or consider the prophet Hosea, whose entire life became a living parable. God commanded him to marry a woman named Gomer, who was repeatedly unfaithful to him. He was to have children with her and give them names like "not my people" and "no mercy." It was a heartbreaking and humiliating ordeal designed to mirror God's own experience with Israel. The nation had been like an unfaithful spouse, chasing after other lovers, the Baals and the nature gods of Canaan. But the story doesn't end with judgment. It ends with God's relentless, pursuing love. God says of Israel, "Therefore, behold, I will allure her, and bring her into the wilderness, and speak tenderly to her. And in that day, you will call me my husband, and no longer my master, and I will betroth you to me forever, in righteousness and in justice, in steadfast love and in mercy." Here, the primary metaphor for God's relationship with his people shifts. It's no longer just the king and his subjects, or the general and his army. It is the intimate, painful, and passionate bond of a marriage. This introduces a depth of pathos, of divine suffering and eased, covenantal, unconditional love that transcends the categories of power and punishment. God's heart can be broken. His primary motivation is not wrath, but a spurned and jealous love that refuses to give up. This prophetic reframing of religion, from nationalistic ritual to ethical living, from a power relationship to a love relationship, is beautifully summarized by the prophet Micah. After pages of condemning both the northern and southern kingdoms for their corruption, he imagines a person asking the essential question, "With what shall I come before the Lord? Shall I come with burnt offerings, with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul?" A direct reference to the Canaanite practice of child sacrifice. Micah sweeps all of this aside with one of the most sublime verses in all of Scripture. "He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God?" In this single sentence, the entire complex sacrificial system is reframed. The essence of what God wants is not ritual, but relationship. It is an ethical life do justice. A compassionate heart love kindness, and a humble posture walk humbly with your God. This is a revolution in religious thought, happening from within the tradition itself. Once the prophets had critiqued the present, once they had dismantled the false securities of the nation, they began to do something even more radical. They began to paint a picture of the future, a future that looked nothing like their present and nothing like the past. A future where God's ultimate purpose would be fulfilled in a new and astonishing way. This is where the whispers of peace begin to become a chorus. The prophet Isaiah, speaking in a time of political turmoil, with the great Assyrian war machine threatening to swallow the entire region, delivers a vision that is breathtaking in its scope. He says, "It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and all the nations shall flow to it." Let's pause and unpack this image. In the ancient world, mountains were often seen as the homes of the gods. The highest mountain signifies ultimate authority. But notice what happens. The nations are not conquered by Israel's armies. They are not dragged to Jerusalem in chains. They flow to it like a river drawn by an irresistible force. And why do they come? That he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. They come not for conquest, but for instruction. Jerusalem becomes not a military capital, but the world's center for moral and spiritual education. And what is the result of this education? Isaiah continues, "He shall judge between the nations, and shall decide disputes for many peoples." God himself becomes the world's supreme court, resolving conflicts not with force, but with wisdom. And because of this, something incredible happens. "And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." This is a direct and total reversal of the world they knew, and of the commands for holy war from their own history. The very tools of war, the swords and spears, are not merely to be abandoned. They are to be reforged. The metal of death is to be transformed into tools for life, plowshares to till the soil, pruning hooks to care for the vineyard. The economy of destruction becomes an economy of cultivation. The change is so fundamental that war ceases even to be a part of the curriculum. The academies that train soldiers and strategists will go out of business. Humanity will collectively unlearn the art of killing. This is not just a ceasefire. It is the abolition of war from the human experience. It is a vision of absolute peace, Shalom, breaking into history. And this vision of peace is not merely political, it is cosmic. In another famous passage, Isaiah speaks of a future king, a shoot that will come from the stump of Jesse, King David's father. This new king will not rule by the standards of the world. He won't judge by what his eyes see or his ears hear. Instead, with righteousness, he shall judge the poor and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. His power is moral power. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. His weapons are words of truth. And the peace this king brings extends beyond the human realm into the very fabric of creation itself. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, Isaiah dreams. The leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the lion and the fattened calf together, and a little child shall lead them. This is a picture of Eden restored. The fundamental enmity between predator and prey, the violence that is woven into the natural order, is healed. The world returns to a state of harmony so complete, so safe, that a small child can lead the most ferocious of beasts. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain. The vision concludes, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. True, lasting peace is a direct result of the universal knowledge of God. As if this wasn't revolutionary enough, the prophets identified another massive barrier to this peace, the human heart. It wasn't just a problem of political systems or social injustice. The problem was deeper. The prophet Jeremiah, who lived to see the final destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, diagnosed the problem with chilling accuracy. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? If the problem is inside us, then an external solution, like a law written on stone tablets, will never be enough. You can command people not to be greedy or violent, but you can't change their desire to be so. And so, Jeremiah delivers one of the most hopeful and pivotal prophecies in the entire Old Testament. He speaks of a day when God will make a new covenant with his people. It will not be like the covenant I made with their fathers, my covenant that they broke, God says. But this is the covenant that I will make. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. This is a game changer. The law is no longer an external code that coerces behavior. It is an internal principle that transforms desire. God is going to perform a kind of spiritual heart surgery, rewriting our very nature so that we want what he wants. Righteousness will flow from the inside out, not from the outside in. A person who has God's law written on their heart doesn't need to be threatened with punishment to do what is right. They do it because it has become a part of who they are. This internal transformation is the only possible foundation for the external, worldwide peace that Isaiah envisioned. This leads us to the final, most radical, and most mysterious development in the prophetic message. A new model for how God would achieve victory over the evil and violence in the world. It is found in a series of poems in the second half of Isaiah, known as the Servant Songs. These poems describe a figure, God's servant, who will bring justice to the nations. But his methods are unlike any king or conqueror. The fourth song, in Isaiah chapter 53, is the most stunning. It paints a portrait of a figure who achieves victory not through power, but through suffering. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him, the prophet writes. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of of sorrows and acquainted with grief. This is the opposite of the glorious, conquering king. This is a figure of profound weakness and humiliation. And why does he suffer? The prophet explains that his suffering is not for his own sins, but for ours. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. Read that last line again. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. This turns the entire logic of holy war on its head. In the conquest of Canaan, peace, or at least a space for Israel to exist, was brought about through the chastisement and destruction of the enemy. Here, peace is brought about through the chastisement and suffering of God's righteous servant. Victory is won not by inflicting violence, but by absorbing it. Redemption comes not by shedding the blood of the guilty, but by the voluntary shedding of the blood of the innocent on their behalf. It is a paradigm of sacrificial, vicarious love that is the polar opposite of military conquest. The servant defeats evil by letting evil do its worst to him, and in doing so, exhausting its power and paying its price. The identity of this servant is left mysterious in Isaiah. At times, the servant seems to be the nation of Israel itself, called to be a light to the nations. At other times, he seems to be an individual, a future messianic figure. This ambiguity allowed the idea to take root, to plant a seed in the imagination of God's people. It was a seed that would lie dormant for centuries, a whispered promise of a different kind of power, a different kind of king, a different kind of victory. So, we see that the Old Testament does not end with the God of armies as the final word. It travels a vast distance. It begins in a world steeped in violence, with a God who meets that world on its own terms. But through the failure of the monarchy and the fiery, poetic voices of the prophets, the story moves. It moves from an external religion of ritual to an internal one of justice and mercy. It moves from a vision of a protected, exclusive nation to a vision of a peaceful, inclusive world. It moves from a model of victory through military might to a mysterious, breathtaking model of victory through suffering love. The trajectory is undeniable. The story is bending, slowly but surely, away from war and toward peace. These prophetic dreams of swords turned to plowshares, of wolves lying with lambs, of a law written on the heart, of a suffering servant who brings healing through his wounds, were, for the people who first heard them, still just dreams. They were a future hope, a promise whispered against the grim reality of exile and foreign domination. The Old Testament ends with a people waiting, clinging to these visions, wondering how and when, and through whom this impossible peace might finally dawn. The stage is set. The questions are hanging in the air. All that is needed is for the main character, the one who will claim to embody these ancient dreams, to walk onto the stage of history. And it is to his arrival that we will turn next. For centuries, those prophetic words we spoke of last time hung in the air of Judea. They were like the scent of rain on a dry and dusty land, a promise of a different kind of future. The dreams of swords beaten into plowshares, of a peaceable kingdom where even predators and prey would lie down together, of a new covenant where God's law would be written on the human heart. These were the hopes that sustained a people living under the thumb of one empire after another: the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and now the iron fist of Rome. The world was waiting. The people were waiting for their Messiah, their anointed one, and in their waiting, their hopes had largely reverted to the older model. They were waiting for a new David, a warrior king who would rally the nation, drive out the pagan Romans with righteous fury, and restore the throne of Jerusalem to its former glory. They were waiting for the God of armies to act again. And then, into this world of simmering rebellion and fervent expectation, a story begins not with a call to arms in the capital city, but with the cry of a baby in an overlooked provincial town called Bethlehem. The first announcement of his arrival comes not to the generals or the high priest in the temple, but to a group of shepherds, humble men on the fringes of society, watching their flocks by night. And the heavenly army that delivers the message comes not with swords, but with a song. And its anthem is not a war cry, but a promise. Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace among those with whom he is pleased. Right from his very first breath, Jesus of Nazareth is framed not by the theme of war, but by the theme of peace. His forerunner, the strange and fiery prophet John the Baptist, emerges from the wilderness not preaching rebellion, but repentance. He calls people to a baptism of cleansing, a turning of the heart back to God, to prepare the way of the Lord. The preparation for this king is not military training, but moral and spiritual renewal. When Jesus himself begins his public life after his baptism by John, the story takes him immediately into the wilderness for 40 days of fasting and temptation. This is his crucible, the place where he will define the nature of his mission. The final temptation is the most telling. The devil takes him to a high mountain and shows him all the kingdoms of the world in their glory. All these I will give you, he says, if you will fall down and worship me. This is the great offer of political power, the shortcut, the chance to achieve the messianic goal of ruling the nations through a simple compromise by adopting the world's methods of power and domination. Jesus' refusal is absolute. Begone, Satan. For it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve. He rejects the path of political conquest from the very beginning. His kingdom will be built on a different foundation. Having rejected the world's model of power, Jesus begins to announce and describe his own. He walks to the shore of the Sea of Galilee and begins to gather his followers, not elite soldiers or religious scholars, but fishermen, common laborers. And then, one day, he goes up on a mountain. His disciples gathered around him, and he delivers the great manifesto of his kingdom. We call it the Sermon on the Mount, and it is perhaps the most radical and revolutionary political and ethical speech ever given. It is the constitution of the kingdom of God, and it turns the world's values completely upside down. He begins with a series of blessings we call the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, he says, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom belongs not to the proud and self-sufficient, but to those who know their own spiritual bankruptcy. Blessed are the meek, he continues, for they shall inherit the earth. In a world where the strong, the aggressive, and the ruthless inherit the earth through conquest, Jesus declares that ultimate ownership belongs to the gentle, the humble, the non-assertive. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Think about that last one. In the age of the judges and kings, the mighty warrior was the hero, the deliverer, the one who showed he was on God's side. Jesus completely redefines the family resemblance. The true children of God are not the war makers, but the peacemakers. They are the ones who actively work to reconcile, to heal, to mend what is broken. He is building a new kind of community, a nation whose defining characteristics are humility, mercy, and a commitment to peace. But he doesn't stop with these general principles. He gets incredibly specific, taking the old law of Moses and driving it deeper, from an external action to an internal disposition. You have heard that it was said to those of old, "You shall not murder." But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. He pushes the prohibition against violence all the way back to its source, the anger in the human heart. The problem isn't just the swinging of the sword, it's the seed of rage from which all violence grows. To be a citizen of his kingdom means to be at war, not with an external enemy, but with the anger inside yourself. Then he addresses the logic of retaliation head on. You have heard that it was said, "An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." This principle, from the Old Testament law, was actually a step forward in its time. It was meant to limit vengeance, to keep it proportional, to prevent a blood feud where one lost eye leads to a lost life. It was a principle of managed legal retribution. Jesus sweeps it entirely off the table. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. This is one of the most misunderstood teachings of Jesus. It is often read as a call to be a passive doormat, to allow evil to trample all over you. But in its original context, it was a brilliant and courageous strategy of non-violent resistance. A slap on the right cheek from a right-handed person would have been a backhand slap. This wasn't an assault meant to injure. It was a gesture of deep insult, the way a master would strike a slave or a social inferior. It was about humiliation and putting someone in their place. By turning the other cheek, the left cheek, you are presenting your face for a proper punch with a closed fist. You are, in essence, courageously saying, "I refuse to be humiliated. I am your equal. If you are going to strike me, you must strike me as an equal, not as an inferior. It's a move that seizes the initiative, shames the oppressor, and breaks the cycle of insult and retaliation with a defiant act of self-respect. He continues with other examples. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. In that culture, a person's tunic was their inner garment. Their cloak, or outer garment, was essential for warmth and survival. And the law of Moses actually forbade a creditor from keeping a man's cloak overnight as a pledge. By giving the plaintiff your cloak as well, you would be left standing in your loincloth. You would be exposing not only your own nakedness, but the greed of the person who is suing you. It's a form of street theater, a shocking act of protest that exposes the injustice of the system. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. This was a direct reference to the Roman practice of Angaria, where a Roman soldier could compel a civilian in an occupied territory to carry his heavy pack and gear for 1 Roman mile, but no more. It was a constant, hated reminder of their subjugation. The natural response would be to do it with simmering resentment, counting every step until the mile was up. Jesus says to willingly, even cheerfully, go a 2nd mile. Imagine the soldier's confusion. At the 1 mile marker, he expects his pack back, but you keep walking. You have turned an act of compulsion into an act of free choice. You have taken control of the situation. You have robbed him of his power to humiliate you, and have perhaps even opened up a space for a human interaction, forcing him to ask, why are you doing this? It's a creative, disarming, and powerful way to assert your own humanity and freedom in the face of oppression. All of this builds to the summit of his teaching, the absolute pinnacle of his new way. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. This was the common understanding, a distillation of the world's wisdom. It is natural to love those who love you and to hate those who threaten you. It is the logic that underpins all nationalism, all tribalism, and all war. Jesus takes this fundamental logic of human society and demolishes it. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. This is the most radical command ever uttered. It is not just about non-retaliation. It is not just about creative non-violence. It is a call to an active, positive, and redemptive goodwill toward the very people who wish you harm. It is a command to desire their good, to work for their benefit, to pray for their well-being. This command replaces the logic of elimination, which powered the old holy wars, with the logic of redemption. The goal is no longer to destroy the enemy, but to transform the enemy into a neighbor, into a brother. With this single command, Jesus makes it impossible for any of his followers to participate in the act of war, which by its very nature requires the dehumanization and destruction of the enemy. He has taken the prophetic vision of Isaiah and made it the foundational law of his kingdom. Of course, it wasn't enough for him to just teach these things. His entire life became a demonstration of this new kingdom of peace. His actions were a living sermon. Just look at the group of 12 men he chose as his inner circle. Among them was Matthew, a tax collector. Tax collectors were Jews who worked for the Roman occupiers, collecting taxes from their own people to fund the Roman war machine. They were seen as traitors, collaborators, and religious outcasts. In the same group was Simon, who is explicitly called the Zealot. The Zealots were a first-century Jewish resistance movement, a group of passionate nationalists who believed in using violence, assassination, guerrilla warfare to overthrow the Romans. They were the ideological opposites of the collaborators. In any other context, if a Matthew and a Simon were in the same room, they would have been at each other's throats. They were mortal enemies. Jesus calls them both, puts them side by side, and says, "Follow me." The community he builds around himself is a living, breathing miracle of reconciliation. He takes a collaborator and a revolutionary, a pro-Roman and an anti-Roman, and makes them brothers in a new kingdom that transcends these earthly conflicts. His very fellowship is a model of peacemaking. His power, the divine power he wielded, was also exclusively used for peace. It was always creative, never destructive. His disciples didn't always understand this. On one occasion, they were traveling to Jerusalem and tried to pass through a Samaritan village. The Samaritans, who had a long-standing ethnic and religious feud with the Jews, refused to welcome them. Two of his disciples, James and John, were incensed. "Lord," they asked, "do you want us to call fire down from heaven to consume them?" They were ready to enact a little Old Testament-style judgment. They wanted to be warriors for God. Jesus' response is swift and sharp. He rebukes them. He turns and walks away. His power is not for destroying those who reject him. Instead, what does he do with his power? He touches a leper, a social and religious outcast, and makes him clean. He gives sight to a man born blind. He commands a paralyzed man to get up and walk. He calms a raging storm. He multiplies a few loaves and fish to feed a hungry crowd of thousands. He even raises the dead. Every single one of his miracles is an act of restoration, of healing, of bringing life and wholeness where there was sickness, brokenness, and death. He is waging a war, but it is a war against disease, against despair, against demonic oppression, and against death itself. He is fighting for creation, not against it. He constantly had to redefine what his kingdom was, because people kept trying to force him into their military Messiah mold. After he fed the 5,000, the crowd was so amazed by his power that they wanted to take him by force and make him their king. They saw a man who could create food out of nothing and thought, "This is the one who can feed our armies. This is the one who can lead the revolution." Jesus' response is to immediately withdraw from them and go up into the mountain by himself. He runs from the crown they try to offer him. The clearest definition he gives comes at the very end, when he is on trial for his life before the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. Pilate, a man who understood only the logic of power and violence, asks him the crucial question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus' answer is profound. "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world." This is his definitive statement. The reason his followers are not engaged in a bloody battle outside Pilate's headquarters is because the very nature of his kingdom is different. It is not a kingdom established by the sword, and so it cannot be defended by the sword. Its source, its methods, and its goals are not of this world, not of this system of power built on violence and coercion. The ultimate test of this commitment comes just a few hours earlier, in the darkness of the Garden of Gethsemane. A detachment of soldiers and officials comes to arrest him. This is the moment of crisis. This is when all the talk and theory gets put to the test. One of his most zealous followers, Peter, does what seems natural. He does what any loyal follower of a king would do when their leader is threatened. He draws a sword and attacks, slicing off the ear of the high priest's servant. The holy war has begun. Peter has fired the first shot. Jesus' reaction is immediate and absolute. He doesn't praise Peter's loyalty. He doesn't join the fight. He commands him, "Put your sword back into its place." And then he gives the reason, a timeless principle that echoes down through the centuries. For all who take the sword will perish by the sword. He sees that violence is a self-perpetuating cycle. It promises to save you, but in the end, it consumes you. Then, in his last act as a free man, with the soldiers closing in around him, Jesus reaches out his hand to his enemy, to the man who has come to arrest him, and he touches the wounded servant and heals him. This is the Sermon on the Mount in flesh and blood. He literally loves his enemy and heals the wound that his own follower has inflicted. He actively undoes the violence committed in his own defense. It is the perfect, final demonstration of his way of peace. This leads us to the cross. The cross is the ultimate enactment of the way of the suffering servant that Isaiah had dreamed of. Here, Jesus confronts the combined violence of the world. The religious system condemns him. The political and military power of the Roman Empire executes him. The mob screams for his blood. He has all the power of heaven at his disposal. As he told his disciples in the garden, "Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels?" But he refuses. He chooses the path of non-resistance, not out of weakness, but out of a different kind of strength. Instead of fighting back, he absorbs it all. He takes all the hatred, the injustice, the violence, the mockery, the sin of the world onto himself. He becomes the living embodiment of the command to love your enemies. From the cross, as soldiers gamble for his clothes and his executioners stare up at him, he doesn't call down curses or fire from heaven. He prays, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." This is the strange victory of God. The cross is not a tragic defeat. It is the climax of Jesus' mission. It is where the logic of the suffering servant is fully realized. Peace is made, atonement is achieved, and evil is defeated, not by inflicting violence, but by absorbing it in an act of infinite, enemy-loving, self-giving sacrifice. God's definitive answer to the problem of human evil and war is not an overwhelming display of coercive force, but the vulnerable, heartbreaking, and world-changing power of the cross. It is the ultimate sword beaten into a plowshare, the ultimate spear turned into a pruning hook. The instrument of torturous death becomes the very source of eternal life. So we see that Jesus, in his life, his teachings, his community, his actions, and his death, provides the definitive answer to our question. He takes the prophetic whispers of peace and turns them into a clear and unmistakable symphony. He is the fulfillment of Isaiah's vision. He embodies the way of peace. He redefines God's kingdom as a spiritual reality that grows through love and sacrifice, not a political one that grows through violence and coercion. He replaces the command to destroy our enemies with the non-negotiable command to love them. He shows that God's ultimate victory over darkness is not won through the power of the sword, but through the profound and mysterious power of the cross. Jesus has given us the model. He has shown us the way. But then he ascended, leaving his followers behind in a world that is still very much a place of violence, a world of armies and nations and conflicts. The question that flows directly from his life is now a question for us. How are we, the people who claim to follow this Prince of Peace, supposed to live out his radical ethic in a world that still believes in the power of the sword? How do we navigate our place as citizens of his heavenly kingdom, while also being citizens of earthly nations that still learn and practice the art of war? That is the challenge he left for his church, and it is the final part of the story we must explore together. And so we are left here in the quiet of this moment with this beautiful, terrifying, and world-altering picture of Jesus, a king whose throne is a cross, a warrior whose only weapon is love, a conqueror who wins not by killing his enemies, but by dying for them. He has given us the definitive answer from the heart of God. He has taken the whispers of the prophets and amplified them into a symphony of peace. We have seen the story pivot, turning away from the smoke of the battlefield and toward the stunning, enemy-forgiving love of the cross. But what now? What does this mean for us, sitting here in our own time, so far removed from those dusty roads in Galilee? Jesus has shown us the way. But how are we, the people who claim to follow him, meant to walk it in a world that is still so full of anger, division, and violence? This is the question that the first followers of Jesus had to face immediately. They were a tiny, fledgling movement in the heart of the mighty Roman Empire, a society built on military power and enforced by the sword. How did they live out the teachings of the Prince of Peace in the shadow of Caesar? For the first few centuries, the answer was remarkably consistent. The early Christian writers, the so-called church fathers, overwhelmingly saw participation in military service as incompatible with a commitment to Christ. Tertullian, a brilliant and fiery writer from North Africa in the late 2nd century, asked the pointed question, "Shall it be held lawful to make an occupation of the sword, when the Lord proclaims that he who uses the sword shall perish by the sword? And shall the Son of Peace take part in the battle when it does not become him even to sue at law?" His logic was simple. Jesus commanded his followers to be peacemakers. A soldier's job is, by definition, to be a potential war maker. The two seemed irreconcilable. Origen, another great thinker from Alexandria, argued that Christians served the empire in a more powerful way than soldiers did. He wrote that Christians, by their prayers and their righteous lives, fight on behalf of the emperor, forming a special army of piety that defeats the spiritual enemies of the nation. They believed their warfare was on a different plane entirely. For about 300 years, this was the dominant view. Christians were, by and large, pacifists. They were known for their strange refusal to participate in the violence of the state. Their allegiance was to another kingdom, and that kingdom had a different way of dealing with its enemies. But then, in the early 4th century, everything changed. The Roman emperor himself, Constantine, converted to Christianity. This event, often called the Constantinian shift, turned the Christian world upside down. The church went from being a persecuted minority to being the favored, official religion of the empire. Suddenly, Christians were no longer on the outside looking in. They were on the inside. They were senators, governors, and leaders. The emperor himself was now a Christian, and the emperor had an army. The emperor had borders to defend and rebellions to crush. This created a profound theological and ethical crisis. What does the Prince of Peace have to say to a Christian emperor who needs to command an army? It was in this new, complicated reality that theologians like Augustine of Hippo began to develop what we now call the just war theory. It was an honest and profound attempt to wrestle with this new problem. Augustine, who knew the teachings of Jesus deeply, was not trying to bless all wars. Far from it. He was trying to drastically limit them, to create a strict ethical framework for a fallen world where violence sometimes seemed unavoidable. The theory laid out stringent criteria. A war could only be considered just if it had a just cause, like defending the innocent from attack. If it was declared by a legitimate authority, if the intention was to restore peace, and not simply to gain power, and if it was truly a last resort after all peaceful means had failed. Further principles were developed about how a war must be conducted, avoiding harm to civilians, using proportional force. This theory has been the dominant way that mainstream Christianity has thought about war for most of the last 1700 years. It is an attempt to hold two realities in tension: the radical peace ethic of Jesus and the messy, often violent responsibilities of governing a nation a broken world. It acknowledges that we are not yet in the peaceable kingdom Isaiah dreamed of. But for many Christians, then and now, this solution has always felt uncomfortable, like a compromise that leans too far away from the clear command of Jesus to love your enemies. The tension between the Sermon on the Mount and the reality of a world at war has remained at the heart of the Christian struggle ever since. So, how do we navigate this? The New Testament itself seems to anticipate this tension. It recognizes that we live in a world of conflict, but it radically redefines the nature of that conflict and the weapons we are to use. The Apostle Paul, who wrote a huge portion of the New Testament, constantly uses military language. He talks about fighting, wrestling, and waging war. But he always applies it to a spiritual reality. The most famous example is in his letter to the church at Ephesus. He is writing to a community living in a major city of the Roman Empire, a place full of soldiers and power struggles. He tells them, finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. An armor, a battle. This sounds like a call to arms. But then, Paul delivers the pivotal sentence that changes everything. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood. Let's let that sink in. Our struggle, our real fight, is not against other people. It's not against the neighboring country, the rival political party, the person who insults us. The enemy is not human. Our struggle, Paul says, is against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Paul takes the entire paradigm of war and lifts it into the spiritual realm. The true enemies are not people, but the spiritual powers of pride, greed, hatred, deception, and injustice that hold people captive. Our battle is against the disease, not against the other patients who are also suffering from it. Having redefined the enemy, Paul then describes the armor we are to wear for this spiritual battle. And it's a very strange kind of armor. He says to fasten on the belt of truth. Our primary defense is a commitment to what is real and true in a world of lies. Then, put on the breastplate of righteousness, protecting our heart not with steel, but with a life of integrity and justice, living in a right relationship with God and others. For shoes, we are to wear the readiness given by the gospel of peace. Think of the beautiful irony in that. Our footwear for this battle, the very things that give us a firm footing, are made of peace. We stand firm by being agents of reconciliation. We are to take up the shield of faith, our trust in God's goodness and promises, which can extinguish all the flaming darts of the evil one, the darts of doubt, fear, and despair. On our head, we wear the helmet of salvation, the confident assurance that we belong to God, and that our ultimate destiny is secure in Him. This protects our minds from the hopelessness that these cosmic powers want to inflict on us. After all this defensive armor, Paul mentions only one weapon that can be used for offense. It is not a spear or a javelin. It It is the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. Our only weapon is the truth of God, His promises, His character, His story as revealed in the Scriptures. And how are we to wield all of this? Paul concludes by saying, praying at all times in the Spirit, with all prayer and supplication. The primary activity of this spiritual soldier is prayer. The battle is won on our knees. Paul is systematically co-opting the language of Roman military might and subverting it. He is telling Christians that they are in a war far more serious and with much higher stakes than any of Caesar's campaigns. But the enemy is different, the armor is different, and the weapons are different. We fight not by shedding blood, but by living in truth, righteousness, faith, and prayer. We advance the kingdom not with legions, but with love. This is the warfare that is consistent with the way of the Prince of Peace. So if this is our true battle, how do we live it out? How do we become the peacemakers that Jesus called sons of God? The call to love our enemies begins not on the international stage, but in our own hearts and our own neighborhoods. For most of us, the enemy is not a soldier in a foreign army. The enemy is the coworker who undermines us. The enemy is the family member from whom we are estranged after a bitter argument. The enemy is the person on social media from a different political tribe, whom we are tempted to demonize and insult. The enemy is the neighbor whose dog barks all night. It is in these small, daily conflicts that the command to love our enemies finds its real-world testing ground. To be a peacemaker is to choose, deliberately, to absorb an insult rather than returning it. It is to practice the radical act of forgiveness, which is the spiritual equivalent of a ceasefire, choosing to halt the cycle of offense and retaliation. Forgiveness is not about saying what happened was okay. It's about saying that you will not let what happened define the future. It is refusing to be a prisoner of the past and refusing to pass your pain on to someone else. It's a difficult, costly, and deeply healing practice. To be a peacemaker is to follow the example of Jesus with the woman caught in adultery. When the mob was ready to execute her, he didn't join them, nor did he simply condemn them. He knelt down and quietly disarmed them with a gentle challenge. Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her. One by one, they dropped their rocks and walked away. He protected the victim without destroying the perpetrators. This is the creative, disarming wisdom of peace. To be a peacemaker is to take seriously the parable of the Good Samaritan. Jesus told this story when an expert in the law asked him, "Who is my neighbor?" The hero of the story is a Samaritan, a member of a despised ethnic and religious group. He is the one who stops to help a Jewish man who has been beaten and left for dead. After the righteous religious leaders of the man's own people have passed by on the other side, the Samaritan crosses every social, political, and religious boundary of his day to show mercy to his enemy. Jesus' answer is clear. Your neighbor is anyone in need that you have the power to help. regardless of their tribe, their religion, or their nationality. Peacemaking means actively crossing the lines we draw between us and them to show compassion. Ultimately, the church itself is meant to be God's primary exhibit of this peace. It is meant to be a contrast society, a community where the world can see what life looks like when Jesus is king. It should be a place where people of different races, different economic classes, different political affiliations, and different backgrounds are united as one family. A place where Matthew the collaborator and Simon the zealot can wash each other's feet. The church, when it is being true to its calling, is a living, breathing demonstration that the peace of Christ is more powerful than the divisions of the world. It is a signpost pointing toward a different way of being human. And this brings us to our final hope. We live in the tension, don't we? We try to be peacemakers, but the world is still full of war. We try to love our enemies, but our hearts are still so often full of anger and fear. We see the beauty of Jesus' kingdom, but we live in a world that still operates by the rules of Babylon and Rome. This is because, as the theologians say, we live in the time of the already, but not yet. The kingdom of God has already broken into the world through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, but it is not yet here in its fullness. We live in the overlap of the ages, with one foot in the new creation and one foot in the old. This is why we feel the strain. This is why we groan, waiting for the full redemption that was promised. And the Bible ends with a stunning vision of that full redemption. The final book, Revelation, is a strange and beautiful vision of how God's story concludes. It's full of cosmic battles and cataclysmic imagery, but we must read it through the lens of Jesus. Who is the hero of heaven? Who is the one who is finally worthy to unroll the scroll of history and bring God's plan to its climax? The prophet John looks, and he expects to see a lion, the symbol of power and royalty. But what he sees is a lamb standing, as though it had been slain. The hero of the end of the story is the same as the hero of the middle of the story. It is the slaughtered lamb. The victory of God at the end of time is the victory of the cross, applied to the entire cosmos. It is the triumph of self-giving, enemy-loving, sacrificial love. And this lamb creates a new world, a new city, the New Jerusalem. And John gives us a glimpse of it. Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man, he writes. God himself will come to live with us, and he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. This is the end of all suffering. It is the end of all that is born from violence. The city has no need for a sun or moon, for the glory of God is its light. Its gates are never shut, a symbol of perfect security and welcome. And into this city, the nations and the kings of the earth do not come as conquered subjects, but they will bring their glory into it. And the leaves of the tree of life, which stands in the middle of the city, are for the healing of the nations. That is God's final word on the subject of war: healing, not destruction, reconciliation, not conquest. An eternal, joyful, all-embracing peace. That is where the story has been heading all along. So, is God in favor of wars? We've journeyed a long way to answer that. We saw him entering into a violent, ancient world, using the language of war to begin a plan of redemption. We saw how that model proved unstable. We heard the prophets begin to sing a new song of peace. We watched Jesus embody that peace, redefine God's kingdom, and achieve the ultimate victory, not with a sword, but with a cross. And we've seen how we are called to live as agents of that peace, while we wait for the final healing of the nations. The arc of the story is long, but it bends unmistakably toward peace. God's heart, his character, and his eternal purpose are not found in the clash of swords, but in the welcome of a father, in the embrace of a husband, in the self-sacrifice of the Lamb. His ultimate desire, his final word, is and always has been shalom. A peace that is not just the absence of conflict, but the vibrant, joyful presence of wholeness, justice, and love for all. May you find your rest in the promise of that peace tonight.